Jane, who also introduces herself as Tess, is a presumably unemployed 21-year-old woman who lives in an apartment in Chatsworth, Los Angeles, with her two dysfunctional crack-smoking drug-addicted roommates. Melissa, Melissa's boyfriend Mikey, and her Chihuahua dog Starlet. Jane, who frequently smokes crack with Melissa and Mikey, decides she wants to personalize her room. Jane decides to buy new cheap furniture at neighborhood yard sales. After picking up items from other yard sales that day, she comes across an older woman named Sadie, from whom she buys a thermos. At that point, the story gets a twist. While Melissa and Mikey argue downstairs, Jane discovers a stash of money in the thermos in the form of several old $100 bills. After counting it up, it amounts to nearly $10,000. Jane spends some of the money on extravagant luxuries such as a new dog collar for Starlet, expensive manicures, some new clothes, and drugs. However, Jane feels guilty about spending some stranger's money and returns it to Sadie. When she goes to Sadie's house to try to return it, Sadie dismisses her before Jane can explain why Jane showed up. Jane decides to keep the money for herself and follows Sadie as she becomes more curious about her. Jane follows the older woman as she takes a taxi to the nearby grocery store. While Sadie is shopping, Jane pays the cab driver and sends it away so she can offer Sadie a ride, which Sadie reluctantly accepts. The two women spend time together in Sadie's house, and Jane gives her phone number to a skeptical Sadie and tells her to call her if she needs anything. The following day, Jane surprises Sadie when she joins her at a bingo game. Jane again pays off Sadie's taxi so she can drive home. On the way, Jane asks Sadie about her finances, which prompts Sadie to spray Jane with mace. The two talk to the police, and Jane explains that she is just being friendly, then leaves visibly angry. Sadie calls Jane the next day, wanting to apologize for overreacting after she realizes that Jane was being a friendly Samaritan. Over the next several days, Jane spends more time with Sadie as they get to know each other. Jane claims that she moved to California over a year ago from a small town in the Midwest to find herself and work as a temp worker. Sadie tells Jane that she has been a widow for 40 years after her husband, a compulsive gambler, died suddenly at age 51. Meanwhile, Melissa is fired from her job, but after Jane convinces their boss to reconsider, he decides to freeze Melissa from work for a month. When Jane shows up for work, it is here that it is revealed that both Melissa and Jane are porn film stars, and Jane consequently gets a promotion over Melissa, who frequently shows up completely stoned on the sets and cannot perform. While Jane is at a porn convention in nearby Las Vegas for the day, working under her porn alias Tess Steele, she leaves Starlet with Sadie, who loses the dog while tending to her garden. Sadie recovers the dog after a desperate and exhausting search. When Jane arrives later that day to retrieve Starlet, Sadie seems troubled and wants to end their friendship, which upsets Jane. After having a talk with Melissa about the money that she found, Melissa says that Jane should spend the money on someone she cares about. Jane uses the money to buy 2 round-trip first-class tickets to Paris for Sadie and herself. When Jane tells Sadie of the trip she has planned for them at a bingo game, Sadie refuses to go, resenting this further meddling with her life. Wanting Sadie to go on the trip, knowing she would love it, she convinces Sadie that if she wins at bingo, then Sadie has to go on the trip. Jane buys 25 bingo cards but loses because Sadie wins after a dry spell of a year and a half. Though she lost, Jane still tries to convince Sadie to go, to which she ultimately agrees. Back at the apartment, Melissa lashes at Jane after finding out she spent all the money on hers and Sadie's airplane tickets to Paris instead of her. The two engage in a screaming match, and Melissa kicks out Jane. While Jane is at work on the porn set, Melissa goes to Sadie's house and tells her about the stash of money, which Melissa says is why Jane was being friendly to her. After Melissa leaves, Sadie briefly unpacks her suitcase, then rethinks her action. It is implied here that Sadie realizes that the money that Jane found in the thermos was Sadie's late husband's money that he won at illegal gambling and hid it away, with Sadie never realizing its existence until now. Later that day, Jane, ignorant of Sadie's knowledge about the money, pick her up from her home to go to the airport for their trip to Paris. Sadie tells Jane to stop and deliver flowers at the cemetery to pay tribute to her husband. When Jane places the flowers, she notices next to the grave of Sadie's husband, Frank Perkins, 1920 to 1971, is the grave of Sadie's deceased daughter, named Sarah Perkins, 1951 to 1969. The somewhat shaken Jane then returns to the car, and she and Sadie drive away.